Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming along to this UK government event organised by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. The event is titled CCUS Myth Busting Live, Ask the Experts. And the purpose of the event is to separate fact from fiction on CCUS, carbon capture, utilisation and storage. And here we are, we're just over halfway through this COP. So welcome to those who are following online as well. I can tell you that it's a very hot and humid COP and quite a lot of rain as well. You can tell that we're in a rainforest region. But we're here to separate fact from fiction about carbon capture and storage. And we've got a group of experts to share their views with you. And the structure of this 1.5 hours is there's going to be a science teaching, then we're going to do a myth-busting discussion based upon the votes in Slido, and then we'll finish with taking Q&A from you in the audience. So on your seats, you should have an information sheet with a QR code. If you would like to vote, have a look at the questions on the Slido and put your opinions on which do you think is true about CCUS. And while you're doing that, I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So, first of all, would you like to introduce yourself, please? And hold the microphone sort of like that.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be participating in this amazing session. So I'm Natalia Weber. I'm the co-founder and director of CCS Brazil, which is the Brazilian Association for CCUS Technologies in the country. We founded this association about 4 years ago. We have a very different landscape now for CCUS projects. Things are improving quite quickly in the country. And so being able to be here and talking about science and CCUS and the need for these technologies is really important for us in Brazil. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you. Yeah. Would you like to introduce yourself, please, and say what your speciality is?
Is this working?
It is.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am Jasmine Mota. I am from Mexico. I am a geological engineer by background, but I've been working in public policy and also helping and working along with industry, governments, and different stakeholders on CCS stuff. I am the founder of the Mexican CCS platform. We also started 4 years ago, almost there. And for me, speaking about what CCS is and what is the science behind that, and also help to understand what are these myths, whether they are real or not, is very important because I think that is critical to drive decision making. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you. Catherine Romanak, would you like to introduce yourself and your speciality, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, excuse me. My name is Professor Catherine Romanak. I am an environmental geochemist at the University of Texas at Austin. My specialty is developing environmental monitoring practices for carbon geological storage. I have been working on carbon capture and storage for close to 20 years, trying to understand what happens when carbon dioxide goes into the subsurface. How does it move? How secure is it? If it were to leak, what would be the environmental impact on groundwater and surface ecosystems? And so that's been my focus for the past 20 years.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. And online, we should have Dr. Jen Roberts from Strathclyde University. Jen, can you switch your camera on and introduce yourself and your speciality?
Absolutely. My camera should be on. Can you see me?
We can.
Yeah, perfect. Hello, welcome everybody. Yeah, my name is Dr. Jen Roberts from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland. Great to be here virtually. And I am also Deputy Director for the UK Carbon Capture and Storage Research Centre in the UK. My research background is all in geological storage, really ensuring that there is long-term containment of the CO2 that we might be putting underground. But I also work in all questions of social technical transitions, including questions of social and environmental impact. So very happy to be here to answer your questions on those sorts of topics.
Okay, thank you, Jen. And we also have online Dr. Ala Al-Kordeji. Ala, would you like to introduce yourself with your camera on, please?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
If we can hear and we can see you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. I'm Ara Al-Kordeji, I'm a research fellow at Imperial College London. I am also lead author for the IPCC 7th assessment report. My research sits at the interface of science policy, specifically using integrated assessment modeling to analyze and assess and construct long-term mitigation scenarios and pathways in line with the Paris Agreement goals. And the recent focus of mine is on carbon capture and storage and defining what abated emissions could mean or should mean scientifically, but also technically, if we are to genuinely meet the Paris Agreement goals. And it's my pleasure to be here with the panel and for the discussion. Thank you.
Ala, thank you very much. And if you missed the start of Ala's introduction, he is the lead author for the IPCC, and that's an important point. This panel is intended to be science-based, and hence the academics and experts that we have here with us today. So, with those introductions, we have a teach-in video provided by Dr. Emily Shugborough. She's Director of Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge and recently appointed as the Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK Government Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. So we have a brief teach-in video from Emily.
Hello, my name's Professor Emily Shugborough. I've worked on climate issues as a scientist for over 30 years. I currently serve as Director of Cambridge Zero, the University of Cambridge's climate initiative. Most recently, I was appointed Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero in the UK Government. I'm here to talk to you about the science behind carbon capture, utilisation and storage, or CCUS as it's more commonly known. To start, let's take a step back. Carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas. It makes up only a tiny fraction of our atmosphere, but it acts like a blanket around the Earth, letting sunlight in, but preventing some of the heat escaping back to space. The more CO2 we add, the thicker the blanket becomes, and the more heat gets trapped. That's why our planet is warming faster now than at any time in human history. To reach net zero, we need to do two things. Number one, stop adding more CO2 by reducing emissions. And number two, remove CO2 from the atmosphere to deal with the CO2 that's already there. CCUS is a crucial puzzle piece in the jigsaw tackling climate change because it can help with both. It can be used to prevent emissions that are otherwise hard to stop, such as those from manufacturing products like cement, steel, or fertilizers. The production of cement, for example, involves the separation of CO2 from limestone, and no amount of renewable electricity can get around that chemical reality. These are what we call hard-to-abate sectors. But it can also be used to directly capture CO2 from the air, reducing the amount of CO2 that's already there, or offsetting emissions that are hardest to eliminate, such as air travel. Once captured, it's compressed and transported to a place where it can be safely stored underground, often more than 1 kilometre deep in porous rock formations. This is what we call carbon capture and storage. The rock formations deep underground is a bit like a sponge with holes and pores where the CO2 can fill and stay trapped, and impermeable layers of rock above lock the CO2 away for thousands of years. Finally, the U in CCUS stands for utilisation. The carbon captured can be used in various ways, for example, building materials where it's permanently stored, or it can be turned into sustainable aviation fuel. The physics and chemistry is well understood, and we've been injecting CO2 safely for decades. In fact, the first commercial CCUS project started in the 1990s, and CO2 has been injected into oil and gas reservoirs since the 1970s. You may ask, but why do we need CCUS? Why can't we just rely on other solutions? It's important to be clear, CCUS is not a single solution. It cannot replace renewable energy sources or greater energy efficiency or nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands, forests and soils that naturally absorb carbon. What the science tells us, though, is that we need both to reach net zero. Carbon capture and storage can help us deal with the hardest to abate emissions from heavy industry, while nature-based solutions can help draw down and store carbon at the surface, often bringing additional benefits for biodiversity and local communities. Every credible pathway to net zero shows that CCUS must be part of a balanced portfolio of solutions. It's about turning off the tap of future emissions and mopping up what's already there. So when we talk about how we can use carbon capture for climate benefits, we're talking about applying science to help manage carbon, especially where emissions are hardest to avoid, whilst at the same time rapidly reducing overall fossil fuel use. When we combine innovation with integrity, guided by science and evidence, we can make real progress. Hello, my name's Professor Emily Shukbra. I've worked on climate issues.
Okay, this was the introduction. Thank you very much to Emily for providing that. And I'm just trying to get the results of the votes up, which I can't see on my phone. So could somebody tell me what the most voted topic is? Okay, it's CCUS is too expensive to scale and CCUS is greenwashing. So let's deal with the too expensive to scale one. And just on that, answer the point, it's too expensive to scale. Ala, can you hear?
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you answer that it's too expensive to scale, please?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of delay, but I'm gonna kick off. Yeah, so too expensive to scale. We really need to differentiate this by application. So it's not, there is no one answer fits all applications. So the cost is really dictated by the law of thermodynamics here in terms of the concentration of CO2 in the waste stream. So if we have high concentration, for instance, pure CO2 streams like natural gas processing or ammonia production, then the capture is relatively cheap because the physics work in our favor. But if we have low concentration, so for instance, diluted stream like power plants, power generation, cement production, then the cost is certainly higher. So we need to think about it in terms of the cost of the capture. Dilute stream means the capture unit is more expensive, while concentrated stream is cheaper. But also we need to think about it in terms of the cost of transport and storage. So for high concentration, the barrier would be more of storage and transport infrastructure. And this is why shared hubs across countries and across facilities are critical to lower the unit cost. So that's in terms of the process itself, but also we need to think about when we consider cost compared to what. So as Professor Emily said, for the hard to abate processes or sectors, take for instance cement, roughly 60% of its emissions come from chemical process of calcination, which can't be solved by fuel switching or electrification. So even after all the efficiency and substitution measures, we still need CCS to reduce those residual emissions. And then finally, the role of policy is very key here, obviously, to support these expensive applications and to make the processes or the cost of these processes viable.
Okay, thank you, Ala. And Yasmin, would you like to add?
Thank you very much. Yes, and I think many of the things around the myth of CCS being too expensive, they are well known. We know that CCS is large, capital intensive, and in some cases it's very complex to find a way to put all the different technologies together. But something I have observed over the years working on CCS is that we also have this perception that CCS is a luxury technology that only few countries can afford. And that is something that comes from this situation in which the incentives for CCS or the way to pay for it have to be with oil and gas or with any other activities. So we don't see CCS exactly being funded or paid back only because we are reducing emissions or we are storing CO2. So that is something really, really important to consider. And the other driver for CCS to happen have been the support from governments and public fundings, something that is not happening everywhere, but only in certain wealthy countries or markets. But these days we have utilization, which can help us to fill that gap. But I want to highlight this part of the geographical and economical gap or divide, because in Global South countries, what we have seen is that the public budgets are constrained, industrial emitters operate in tighter margins, carbon markets are shallow or then they don't exist. So those incentives that could help CCS to happen are not there. So more than being only an expensive technology, I think it comes to the enabling conditions that can help CCS to happen. And that is also part of the perception that we have in certain specific regions. So the progress in the Global South, in the Global North is amazing. We see lots of these projects happening. But if we look at the different models and estimations of what should be done and how many projects we need in Global South countries, we still have a lot work to do in terms of financing. So how could we build that enabling environment to allow the budget that is already out there to help us out to be effectively implemented?
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmin. That's a comprehensive answer. And just to point to the previous work of the IPCC, which I think was from their AR4 report in 2014, where they did a sensitivity analysis taking out all of the low carbon energy technologies. And when they took CCS out of the mix, the cost of achieving the climate targets rose very significantly, because CCS is a vital part to get to net zero for those hard to abate sectors that you cannot decarbonize otherwise. And if you don't have CCS, everything else, the mitigation gets far more expensive overall. So that's the it's too expensive to scale topic. The other one that got a high number of votes was CCUS's greenwashing. It's just a way to keep using fossil fuels. and we hear that said a lot. So, Natalia,
Yes, thank you. This is a question that I have a lot here, especially when talking to the press, people that are trying to understand how important CCS is and our ability to actually deploy these technologies. And I think there's many layers to answer to this question, right? So the most important one was already answering this teaching class, which is CCS is absolutely required. It's not something invented. It's not something that we can afford not to have it, right? It's absolutely needed. So we have to deploy it anyways, addressing emissions reductions and addressing CO2 removal from the atmosphere. And we need this all at scale. We need to complement the other sources, the other solutions for reducing and removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And we have that well said and published and available to everyone in the scenarios, in the IPCC scenarios. So if all the serious scenarios, not only from IPCC, but any other attempt to model a scenario for reaching our climate targets in 1.5 or 2 degrees, you always find CCS there. You can find less or a little bit more, but you always find CCS. And when we are when we are seeing our pathway and the distance from our main targets, we are seeing CCS actually increasing in many regions in these modelings, and Brazil is one of these cases. So when we had our target set here in Brazil, our NDC, and we had the modeling for how do we get there, what we had is that we need a lot of CCS, and especially for the circumstances in Brazil, we need a lot of BECCS because we need removals. We need a negative emissions energy sector in Brazil to compensate some activities that has no other alternative. And it's really important to highlight that it's not just only about oil and gas or fossil fuels. It's about bioenergy. It's about capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. And CCS does not create a fossil demand. It's actually forcing responsibility with the externalities of fossil fuels. So it's much more about responsibility, taking responsibility, than actually deciding to just leave the CO2 in the atmosphere. So CCS does not stop the structural decline in fossil fuel demand in the scenarios we have for our climate targets. And misuse of technologies as greenwashing can happen with any technology, with any solution, with anything. So the solution for greenwashing is not rejecting the technology, it's governance and it's regulation. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much. And Yasmin, Natalia's answer.
Thank you very much. Well, I think this myth about CCS being so related and close to fossil fuels comes from its nature itself. Every time we talk about underground operations, people immediately think about oil and gas. And that's not a lie. We know how to deal with all the underground stuff because the experience we have from oil and gas sector, but that doesn't mean that when we are doing CCS, it's exactly that. And this is also a problem when we talk about CCS or CCUS, because CCS is purely undedicated storage, but when we add the U, the primary use of CO2 has been for oil recovery. So that makes sense when people think that CCUS is related to oil and gas, and that doesn't exactly mean greenwashing. That is one of the things. The other one is a contradiction that we have seen with CO2 EOR, because people ask, why are we injecting CO2, capture CO2, if when we produce oil, we're going to burn those fossil fuels and we will have more CO2 back. Well, one of the things I've been working in carbon accounting, which is another area I have been developing my career in, is that over time, the projects where we inject CO2 to produce more oil, they can turn into into a positive carbon footprint. That means that over 25, 23 years, depending on how you manage the well operations, your carbon footprint of the whole project can be different. So we need to be very careful about how we plan our projects, what is the lifetime of those projects, and also understanding that CCS is not a solution, it's part, as we saw in the video, of a broad portfolio of solutions. And it's very important to understand that we can reduce emissions through CCS only if that is along with other step commitments to reduce fossil fuels production. And I think that is one of the key points why some NGOs or activists or environmentalists claim that CCS is a way for the industry to continue their business as usual. Because if you look at the portfolio that a company has and they don't show a well-balanced strategy in which CCS is part of that transition to shift towards something new, of course people are going to criticize that. So we need to be very transparent in our carbon accounting processes, in the way that we communicate and we present the results of what we are doing. And that is also related to the governance. So it's not only about the companies deciding to build a CCS plant, but how we communicate that, how we account for that. And yes, I would like to say that we need to be very careful on how we design the projects to avoid looking into technology or the fossil fuels industry, because CCS, it's a great opportunity to build the transition we need, but we cannot completely deny that in some cases, as Natalia said, any technology can turn into a greenwashing scheme if we don't have proper carbon accounting, governance, monitoring, and transparency in the process.
Yeah. So I think that very good answers there. Transparency is very, very key to this. And then lastly, Alla, would you like to add anything to those answers?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. I think the concern of greenwashing is legitimate and critical concern. And it's a very high risk in case we don't have a robust, transparent, and verifiable definition of or criteria for considering for applications of CCS. And here I'm specifically focusing on the using of the term abated in the IPCC reports, which something that emerged as a contentious issue in the last cycle, but also in COP28 text. And if you look specifically, then the term abated actually does not have a clear definition in the underlying literature. And this is why colleagues from the IPCC and myself, we try to come up with 4 stringent criteria, trying to hopefully make sure that this term is clearly defined. And these 4 criteria, if I may, first of all, is high capture rates. So we propose 95% or greater capture rates, especially for processes where there's high purity CO2 stream. Permanent storage is very important, geological storage in geological formation with robust monitoring and verification. This is also important to really consider any application as an abated fossil fuel or abated CO2 emissions from industrial processes. What is also missed in here typically is the methane control. So fugitive methane, be it upstream or end use, these are also very important. Methane is an important pollutant in the context of global warming, with a warming potential of almost 30 of that of the CO2. So reduction of methane up to 0.5 or even 0.2% from these processes is very important. And then finally, after conducting after meeting all these criteria, so 95% capture, reducing methane to 0.2, and making sure that we have permanent geological storage, then we can look at carbon dioxide removal measures that could offset these residuals. And we know that we have issues with scale on the CCS, we have issues on scale on carbon dioxide removal, and therefore if we focus on really the hard to abate processes, and if we focus the carbon dioxide removal measures really on the applications where we can't 100% capture CO2 or 99% capture CO2, then we are using the limited capacity of this technology to the maximum of their potential.
Okay, Ala, thank you very much. And just to finish on that topic, in general, I think we would all agree that we don't want greenwashing. We want companies and countries to do what they're saying they're going to do. And I'll just end on that point with a quote from Professor Miles Allen of Oxford University, who says, "We have to stop fossil fuels causing climate change before we stop using fossil fuels. No matter how quickly we transition, we must not let fossil fuels keep dumping the CO2 into the atmosphere." Okay, let's move on to another question now. It's unsafe. It's unsafe. We do hear this said quite a lot. So, Catherine, over to you first.
Thank you very much. You know, I think there's two main places where we need to talk about safety, and this is a critical question. I know that CCS is new to many people, so this is the first time they're asking this question, but I want them to know that we asked this question 25 years ago, and we have been using research and demonstration to answer that question for a very long time. So the first thing I would like you to know is that there is a very high level of oversight that is needed to even get a permit for one of these projects. What we have to do is we have to go in and we have to characterize the site. We have to characterize the site, and then we have to use that characterization to make sure that we only store CO2 in areas that will trap the CO2 and accept the CO2. The regulations give us all of the steps that we need to do to develop monitoring protocol to further reduce any risk. And then we monitor the project from the reservoir all the way up. We monitor it during the project and then for many, many years after. So there's a lot of regulatory oversight to this. My group at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the University of Texas started in 2003 with the first injection into a saline aquifer, 500 tons. We looked to see how can we monitor it? Where does the CO2 go? What happens to it underground? And then we scaled up to 1 million tons per year, where we tested every monitoring technology that we had to see what works and what doesn't work. Then we applied that to two industrial scale projects. The one at the time was injecting, the largest in the world at the time was injecting 1.6 million tons per year. And then we were able to down select those technologies to make sure that it was economic to monitor. So that's one part of the safety story. The second part of the safety story is actually how CO2 behaves in the subsurface. It's extremely sticky. This is what we have found. It's extremely sticky. And many people do not realize that CO2, first of all, is stored at least 800 meters deep in the subsurface. It's very deep. And some of these operating projects are storing at 2,000, 3,000 meters deep, okay? So it's very deep and removed from drinking water, and it's removed from the surface. The CO2 is actually stored in the holes in the rock, in between the grains of the rock. So it's very much like if you were going to make a sandwich and you started to spread mayonnaise on your bread, and then you decided you didn't want mayonnaise, so you tried to scrape it off, you could not get all of that out of the bread. It's stuck in the holes. So that's like how CO2 storage works. So what we have found over these 30 years of looking at CO2 and putting it in the rock, again, is that it doesn't move very far, it's very sticky, and it does not like to rise to the top. With 77 projects operating globally right now, over the past 3 decades, we've had 0 reversals. There has been no leak of CO2 from a storage reservoir. Okay, so extremely safe. Now the second part of that is environmental impacts, all right? Okay, what if it does leak? We have to ask that question, what if it leaks? Even though it's not seeming like it's gonna leak and it's not leaking, we still wanna ask that question. So we asked the question, what would happen if it got into our drinking water, right? Well, I think all of you know that carbon dioxide is just fine in your drinking water because we drink water with gas all the time, right? It's not toxic, it's not a waste product, it's fine to ingest. The one thing that we wanted to make sure that the CO2 would not cause the pH to lower and then cause the dissolution of minerals that might mobilize trace metals into the groundwater. And so there was a very large focus on this question. And again, what we have found through doing it in the field, modeling it in the lab, doing experiments, many different approaches, we have found that these metals, if they are mobilized, they never take drinking water out of the quality, drinking water quality. They're very tiny and they drop out just as quickly as they dropped in. So now for us, after all of this research, study, and demonstration and application, we know now that it's extremely secure technology and we feel very good about the safety of CO2 storage.
And so now to Jen, the same question to Jen. Would you like to add to Catherine's point? And I know this is an area you've worked in as well.
Absolutely. I completely agree with what Catherine laid out. And I think what I would add to that is that there's a couple of points. First of all, to reiterate that companies involved in carbon dioxide transport and storage are really strongly motivated to transport it and store it really safely. And there is the role of the regulators and permitters and so on to ensure that those operations are safe, both short term and long term. And the good news there is that we have been capturing CO2 and transporting it quite long distances for many, many decades now. So we have that track record of history of doing industrial scale CO2 capture and transport from which to learn from, in addition to, as Catherine said, this decades of research. What I wanted to add is that also we know from the geological Earth system that there can be CO2 geological stores that have existed for many, many millennia. So these systems where you have CO2 or carbon dioxide in rocks deep underground, those systems exist naturally. And we know from studying those natural trapping systems that we can retain, or that the Earth can retain and secure and hold that CO2 for many, many millenniums. So a very, very long time, and certainly long enough for CO2 that's engineered and placed in the subsurface to be out of the atmospheric cycles that are driving climate change. So not only do we have the Earth track record to learn from around how to safely store that CO2 and retain it in the subsurface, we also have that history of industrial capture, transport and storage as well. This is not, in some cases, it's not a new technology, and so we have that record of practice. And just like any industry and any any processes. When there are any incidences, there's a rigorous learning exercise to make sure that those do not take place again. So that's what I say when there is a multiple decades of history of having done this, then that is to the advantage of understanding what do we need to have in place to make sure this is safe, as well as those monitoring systems that Catherine outlined.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's a really important. The Earth has shown us how CO2 is stored by storing lots of CO2 itself already. And also because we have 77 large-scale projects now operating, injecting about 60 million tons a year of CO2. None have leaked. We've had to engineer leaks to test the environmental impacts. So we've had some great research projects in Australia, where Jen's worked, and in Canada, and in US, Montana, where Catherine has worked, and elsewhere as well, to test the monitoring, to test the environmental impacts. Offshore as well, in the North Sea, we've done that, so we know the impact and we know we can detect it. So that's, it's unsafe. And last of all then, Natalia, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, so this question about the safety is very important for me, because about 9 years ago, when I first had contact with the topic of CCS, first time I've heard about that, that was the question I've done myself. Is this safe, right? And I've been working in my master's, my PhD, all about risk assessment for CCS in the Brazilian context. And I can resonate with all of that was said so far here. So summarizing what I've heard, and for you to have it on your mind as well. So we've listened that CCUS is mature, operational, and we have more than 30 years of experience with these projects abroad, more than 77 projects now, and storing about 65 million tons of CO2 per year, right? And with no incidents so far. So we know the mechanisms that is trapping CO2, as Professor Jen mentioned here, and we know it works for other fluids, including CO2. It's important to highlight that the safety of these operations is validated during the site screening, right? Before we decide to actually start injecting CO2, we do seismic characterization, we do geological modeling, we do flow modeling with reservoir simulations, and we do injectivity tests. So we have all this work done before deciding to actually have a CO2 injection project. And as they mentioned, we monitor with seismic, microseismic sensors, mass balance, and surface monitors as well. And we have years of published data for Quest and Sleipner, for instance, that is open to anybody that wants to read that. And even in extreme scenarios with leakage, we know we have very low rates, localized, easily detected, and easily manageable, right? And so we talk a lot about the CCS risk, but we have to have in mind actually the climate risk, right? The risk of keeping CO2 in the atmosphere, or keeping releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. This is the most important risk. CCS risks can be local, known, and manageable, and climate risks are global, systemic, and irreversible. So CO2 is not toxic, and we should all rest assured that we have no problems with safety of CCS.
Okay, thanks, Natalia. So let's move the last myth on the Slido. It's not a proven technology. Jen, did you hear that? Can we start with you on it?
Of course. Absolutely. So the answer to that question links in really nicely to what was asked previously about safety, because Tim, you mentioned just then as well that there are over 77 projects worldwide currently. And collectively, I think there's a new register launched today from Imperial College London, keeping track of exactly how much CO2 has been put underground since 1996. And we have essentially nearly 400 million tonnes of CO2 placed into the subsurface, locked away there, since injection operations began at Sleipner, at the project that has already been mentioned, which started in 1996. So that's a 30-year period. So when it comes to questions about is this an unproven technology? Well, we can see around the world that there is proven technology in the range of sorts of carbon capture that you need, the range of sorts of transportation that you need, and also in terms of how much CO2 has been placed underground, as well as, like I referred to in my previous response, around the knowledge that the Earth already holds carbon dioxide in the subsurface successfully. So I think in terms of technologically, the answer is, well, the technology is proven, but the complexities to that answer come in around the policy, the financing, and the legislation. Because although we do have many, many projects around the world, those projects are concentrated in certain geographies around the world and certain places where carbon capture and storage, whether for emissions mitigation or carbon dioxide removals, is being incentivized in some way, or there are policy legal frameworks to allow for carbon capture and storage to be economically viable. So I think the answer to that question around whether it's proven typically lies in the response of, well, we may not yet have the environments in terms of the legislation, the policy, and the kind of the paperwork, if you like, to ensure that CCS is an attractive approach. Having said that, we also already, as pointed out, do need that paperwork to allow for the regulations, the permitting, and so on to have safe operations. So it's not a simple answer, but I guess the very short answer to that question is the technology is proven. There are ways to improve it, like to reduce the costs of carbon capture and to demonstrate more diversified sources of carbon dioxide. But the bit that really needs stress tested, that might be holding back CCS as a proven system, is the paperwork and the legislation side.
Okay, thanks very much, Jen. And Alla, what do you think to that?
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think it's all covered by colleagues so far. I guess just to reemphasize point from Jen that according to the IEA, only there are around 400 million ton of announced projects for capture and 600 million ton of announced project for storage. But also, if you put that alongside the statistic that final investment decisions, typically only 20% of announcement reach final investment decisions, and that due to the cost barriers, the regulatory barriers, the logistic barriers that Jen mentioned. And I think also it's important to note that the CCS or CCS in general is a key for industrial processes. Unfortunately, so far, it's only 10% of announced projects, according to latest statistics by IEA, are for industry. So of course, we need to see a lot more upscale on that front. And then if we compare the announced capacity, be it storage, be it capture, compared to the required level of capture CCS in IEA's net zero emission scenario, then we fall short by about 60% of what is required under that specific scenario. So the technology is there, the science is there, but there are barriers to scaling, and there are barriers to turn announcements into final investment decisions.
Okay, Ala, thanks. Catherine.
So I hear a lot of people say this. We shouldn't do CCS because it's not proven at scale. But how do you prove CCS at scale? You have to do more of it, okay? In 1976, 1 watt of electricity through solar costs $104 per watt. It's taken until now to get solar down to something like 30 cents a watt, right? So it's gone down that technology curve. CCS is now doing the same thing. It's being deployed at the scales that it needs to be. We're upscaling it, okay? So what's going to happen with that is we've already seen massive price reductions, especially on capture in the second and third generation of capture technologies. And in the storage side, as researchers, we are already thinking about what are the issues with the upscale, okay? And we actually experienced this briefly when in the US, when the Biden infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts were put in place. We saw the number of projects going from 1 to 60. Once the incentives were put in place, CCS project development took off, okay? And so that's when we started to think about what are the issues we need to think about when projects want to come in next to each other, because that's going to be the upscale. So we're already looking into this. We're already thinking ahead of the curve so that we can be ready for the upscale. So I would say that indeed CCS is proven. We're going to prove it at scale, and we're going to bring the technology costs down, and we're going to start putting emissions away at the scale that we need to. And I have to say that this is true for every technology. We are so far away from our targets. We need to stop talking about it, and we need to get the CO2 in the ground.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think we can be pretty confident on the geological storage being a proven technique. And we also have good experience now with the capture technologies. Now, the early projects were capturing CO2 from fairly pure streams of CO2 from industrial processes. But in 2014, the world's first capture on a coal power station started operating at Boundary Dam in Canada. So that's capturing CO2 from a dilute flue gas. It's about 12% CO2. And that's now achieved 7 million tons in its 10 years of operation. A similar concentration from cement plant, about 12% CO2. Thanks to the Norwegians, the first cement plant with capture started operating this year as well at Brevik. But different technology supplier for the capture. That's really good. We're seeing competition in capture technologies now for capturing from dilute flue gases. So we look forward to more of those being built. And the next is, I'm not going to say it's a challenge because we know we can do it, but for natural gas power generation, CCGTs, the flue gas is about 7% CO2. The world's first one of those is just about to be starting construction in the UK, a net zero Teesside. But we've been capturing from gas in all the coal power stations when they start up already. Confident in the availability of the technologies. So that's the 4 initial questions. I'm going to open it up to the room now. Are there any more questions in the room? We've got loads of questions online, but I'm going to start in the room here. So with the lady here, do we have a mic?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for this lovely panel. I learned a lot, definitely. I'm quite new to the CCS space, but I'm going to be working on it more so in the next year in an offshoot organization that was established by Miles Allen, actually. So thank you for that quote, in Oxford. So I just had a question about the regulatory environment, because you're all representative of very different geographies. So we have the UK, the US, Mexico, Brazil. So I just wanted to know very briefly, whoever one of you wants to pick it up, what are some of these regulatory barriers or even regulatory developments that are incentivizing or actually hindering the scale up of CCS, and especially responsible CCS?
I'll pick that one up. That's a really important question, because it's got to be done in a way that it works and it's safe and secure. And so we do have CO2 storage regulations around the world. The EU has the CCS directive. The UK has got a version of that. We have, under the UNFCCC, in the Clean Development Mechanism in 2011, we developed a set of modalities specifically for CO2 geological storage. In the offshore geological storage environment, the London Convention is the global treaty, and in 2006 that developed its own framework for control and regulation of offshore geological storage. So there's a lot of examples around the world now. We have country-specific regulations in place as well in the US, primarily through their Class 6 system that's administered by the EPA. We have the regulations in place in Canada, in Australia also. And one of the things that we do, and I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning, Tim Dixon, IEA GHG, one of the things that we do is try and assist countries understanding whether they can do CCS in their own countries. And part of that is, if they decide that they want to proceed, how do they develop regulations to control and regulate and permit geological storage? And my colleagues in the International Energy Agency in Paris have a best practice handbook on how to develop regulations for storage, and that draws upon the best practice that we've seen in Europe specifically, and also under the UNFCCC as well. And that's on the storage side. The incentives come on the capture side, really. Different countries have different policies in place to achieve their climate targets and reducing their emissions. It can be emissions trading schemes, cap and trade, where we have the rules in place for CCS in the EU ETS, for example, a clean development mechanism, and very recently in the Paris Agreement, Article 6.4, we have the standard now issued this year, standard on removals and CCS, and the standard on how to deal with any reversals from removals. And they're super broad, those. They cover nature-based as well as the engineered techniques. So there's lots of examples around to draw upon for the regulation, but it's really important. And that's one thing that the World Bank, for example, puts money into countries to help them develop their capacity to develop their regulations to do CCS. Current examples are Timor-Leste, Southeast Asia, and in Nigeria. That was a long answer, and I say that because I've been involved in many of the regulations in the past. Thanks. Yes, please. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much, panel. My name is Trevor Hutchings, and I head up the Renewable Energy Trade Association in the UK. And many of my business members are really quite encouraged at the prospect of generating negative emissions, GGRs, from using CCUS. And I just wondered whether the panel could say a bit more on the potential for that. And in particular, how does it influence the economics of CCUS, given that you know, engineered removals will themselves have a value in the market?
That's a very good question, and I will take that unless one of the panelists would like.
I'll take just an introduction, and then you can pick it up. So there is direct air capture being developed currently. There's, I think, somewhere but like around 140 projects in concept right now being developed. One of the largest one is Stratus in West Texas, and that is very impressive, very impressive. But you're right, if we're going to be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere using direct air capture, we can't be putting it back in by the energy that we use to run that. So you're right, this is a great example of how our technologies need to come together and work together, because we will need renewable technologies to enable direct air capture, because we're taking such a dilute source. So I can just tell you it's being developed, and then so the Stratus project in West Texas, and then in Kingsville in Southeast Texas, Occidental is looking at scaling that up by several orders of magnitude. So it is in it's being developed now, and we do need your renewable energy for that.
Okay, so no, it's just to add something to the removals conversation. Here in Brazil, we are seeing that the removals technologies through BECS actually is the application of CCUS technologies that are actually leading the market, specifically because we might have economic feasibility through this project. So there's a higher interest, I'd say, when we're talking about carbon markets in terms of removal credits, right? And so, since in the case of Brazil, since our capture costs, especially from ethanol production, is much cheaper than other applications, and we have a higher price on these credits, what we're seeing is that the commercial projects that are being announced in Brazil, they're all coming from removals. They're all coming from these ethanol plants.
So just to add, I think for the others in the room, I think, Trevor, you know a lot about bioenergy with CCS BECS, but BECS is a negative emission technology. Biomass, when it's used for energy conversion, is generally regarded as carbon neutral. That CO2 has only recently been removed from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Energy conversion, it's re-released. So hence bioenergy is often treated as a renewable energy source in terms of the carbon aspects of it. If you capture that CO2 from that energy conversion process and inject it and store it deep beneath the ground, you've now removed that CO2 from the atmosphere through that process, thanks to the plant's photosynthesis, and now it's permanently stored. And in all of the climate models, in trying to achieve net zero, we can reduce emissions from large point sources, but there's still going to be some emissions from sectors really hard to abate, like the agriculture and some transport. And to counter those, we're going to have negative emission technologies. And BECS is a really good one because you get a benefit of power and heat out of that process. Direct air capture is another major one being developed that Catherine referred to. That you have to put power and heat into that to make it work. And as Catherine said, that's got to be low carbon power to run those. BECS, you get the advantage of a product out as well that we can use. And so that helps the economics. And where the challenge has been is building that into things like emissions trading schemes. Like in Europe, it was set up to be the maximum reward if you have no emissions. You don't need to surrender any allowances. But what if you've got negative emissions? So for several years, we've been encouraging the EU to work on that. And now we have a framework coming, the CRCF, this Carbon Removal Certification Framework in Europe, that will do that and include DAX and biochar as well. The economics, we need to see what comes out, what the market prices are in the end, but certainly the voluntary carbon market has a price for removals. We see that. And now with Article 6.4, with its standards, we'll see what the compliance markets come up with as well. So thanks. Any other questions in the room? Can we have one here?
Hello, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Olivia Powers, Chief Exec of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, so the trade association representing 120 members across the value chain. Really interesting, and thank you for going over this. I wanted to ask, we've got a good range of speakers here representing both South America, Central America, and UK, North, and Canada. In terms of the challenge and scaling up that was outlined at the beginning, what do you think can be the best outcome of meeting here at COP to bring the industry together in terms of addressing that challenge to scale up the industry to the level that we need to?
Okay. Yes. Yes. The best outcome from the COP, I think we need a strong agreement in general on mitigation. We're seeing that coming through in the Paris Agreement. You know, the two ways that works is through the nationally determined contributions and the long-term strategies looking to the mid-century. And we're in the third tranche of NDCs now, nationally determined contributions, and more of those have got CCS in, as countries realise they put the easier to do mitigations in their first and second. And then even more so in the long-term strategy driven by the high-level agreements on the climate targets. So we want something out in the cover decision, or whatever it's going to be called from this COP, that maintains that momentum and that direction on overall mitigation. I would add also, there's one of the key aspects of this COP is increasing the climate finance for developing countries. Great, the last COP 29 in Baku was the finance COP, and countries agreed 300 million more towards developing countries, which the previous target was 100 million. There's the Baku to Belém roadmap is about increasing that from 300 million to 1.3 trillion of aid from developed to developing countries. So we want to see progress with that so that we can help countries like Brazil and Mexico here and other countries to develop CCS and deploy it themselves. So a good finance outcome would be good as well. And just to, as a side point on that, if I may, one of the other major themes of this COP is adaptation. And we've got to spend a lot more. And some of that finance has got to go to adaptation, particularly for the most vulnerable countries. And what we are hearing is part of that adaptation for small island states is building protection against rising sea level and sea level surges. For that, you need cement and concrete. There's going to be a big carbon footprint with those infrastructure developments for adaptation. CCS is the one way to decarbonize cement production. And there's a question online about, can we define hard to abate? Is sectors where there's no other low carbon alternative. So electricity generation, wind and solar and bioenergy, we can get low carbon electricity electrons, great that way, and nuclear as well. But other sectors like cement especially, hard to abate, there's no alternative. Iron and steel, similar. There's a hydrogen route, but that's really not scaling up. There's aviation and shipping. We can start to apply CCS to the shipping. Aviation was going to need synthetic aviation fuel. That's hard to abate as well. So I've answered a lot into that one answer. Yasmin. And then
Thank you. And just to, can you hear me? Yes. Just to add to Olivia's question, I think one of the outcomes from being here and the message to the government and the industry as well is that to actually achieve the goals and the things that we are committing here, we need the industry. Because most of the time we blame industry for being the huge polluters worldwide, but we are still depending on those countries, and especially in global south countries where industrial activities are growing and expanding and we need more infrastructure. Those things need to be balanced. And for me, that would be one of the key takeaways and share with industry and say, you know, we need to do this. We would like to contribute to CO2 emissions, but for that we need also the government aligned with the industry and sending the correct signals that allow the industries to to go for this kind of projects. Otherwise, we're like stuck into the traditional things that are very limited, especially for hard-to-abate sectors. Perhaps in the energy sector, we have more alternatives. We have also a lot of challenges, but for some industries that we will depend on for the coming years, I mean cement, steel, petrochemicals, and many others, we need to find a way to do that. And from the conversations here and the things that have been committed and negotiated, I think we need to find a way to make the funds that are committed here to move through these processes in a very transparent, clear, and accountable way.
Thank you. And if I can add a perspective from Brazil, it's having this community here, all this carbon management CCUS community here, discussing these topics here, it's very important for raising awareness in the government and in the companies. So I spent this whole week here of COP, and I've seen a lot of new interest from the government, from the Brazilian government, actually, in terms of CCUS activities. I've been asked more about CCUS here because when in Brazil, we are still working on the regulations. We're still working on environmental licensing process. There's an interest. There's a spark already there, but it's not seen as a priority as other solutions are here. So, learning from other experiences and seeing how fast CCS is being deployed in other countries, and all regulations also, not just in terms of project deployment, but the institutional environment readiness, right? It's something that definitely caught the attention of Brazilian private and public sectors. And apart from that, of course, it's really important these opportunities for sharing experiences. What went wrong? What went right? And so, in a way, we don't have to start from scratch, right? And so, this experience of having this COP here in Brazil has been really important for pushing awareness around CCUS activities here in Brazil.
Thank you, Natalia. And it's in the Brazil context, it was great to hear that the national regulatory framework will be released on today for consultation. So that's the person who asked the regulation question is gone, but I should have added that in as well. Apologies. And a bioethanol project in development in Brazil, or at least 2 projects, bioethanol projects in development. So that's very good. And Alla, you would like to answer as well, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just would like to add a couple of points to the last 3 questions. It's important to distinguish that the difference between CCS or CCUS and CDR, carbon dioxide removal. These could be mixed sometimes. So the key for CDR is that the CO2 captured is from the atmosphere, not from fossil fuel sources or from industrial sources. This is a key distinction. The storage has to be permanent and durable, and the removal must be a result of human intervention. And this is very different to CCUS applications. We've got commercial spillovers, learning, and so on. But these two different set of technology, the mitigation one and the removal one. The other point to highlight when we talk about DACs, direct carbon capture and storage, so-called novel methods for CDR. If you look at the state of the carbon dioxide removal report that came out this year, only 0.013 gigaton out of 2.2 gigaton is actually from biochar or bioenergy with BECCS, biochar, or enhanced weathering or DACs. So we're talking about a very small scale already applicable in the market. The second point I would like to raise is a question of what this COP could do is essentially finance and technological sharing, IP sharing across countries, even though the current global political environment doesn't really permit that. But we know that the barriers are mostly cost, regulatory, and technology sharing, and these are once we unlock these barriers, then these technologies could be unlocked at scale. And one final point on hard to abate sectors, I would like to think about these are hard to abate processes. There are processes within these sectors that are really hard to abate, and this is where we could focus our efforts and the use and the scale or the potential scale of CCS on, as opposed to thinking about an entire sector as to being hard to abate it. And this actually thinking from process perspective, that would also allow positive spillover in terms of learning and innovation across multiple sectors as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ala. And Jen, did you want to add anything to the answers to the previous questions from the audience?
Yeah, I would, and I can be very short because, of course, I agree, and it's interesting to hear these contributions. I think one thing that I was going to point out has just been raised by Ella around the distinction between CCS and CDR, or CCS for emissions mitigation and CCS for removals, because I think this links into some of the questions that have also been asked in the Slido. And relating it back to your point, Tim, is understanding that, yes, there are these different processes, as a lab just referred to, and there are these, therefore, these different roles. There's therefore different routes to finance. But the thing I wanted to highlight is the relationship between CCS for emissions mitigation and CCS for removals, and the link to adaptation, in that if we do not decarbonize fast and now, and we don't accelerate these COP level agreements to incentivize and accelerate that, then we're going to need more CDR, not just for those residual emissions that have been referred to, but also to balance the climate back to safe levels. We are on track for overshoot, so you need CDR also to balance the climate to allow for safe environmental living on this planet. So the less that we reduce emissions now through the mitigating emissions from hard to abate sectors and from transition and transformation of society, then the more we're going to rely on CDR in the future. And so although aspects of the technologies are very similar, I also wanted to, and they are distinct, as Elijah just highlighted, I wanted to indicate the relationship they have, and then of course linking it back to adaptation, Tim, as you described at the beginning of the answer to Olivia's question, around then the need for CDR when thinking about an overshoot planet. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, because I think everyone else's answers have been very comprehensive.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. So I'm now looking at the questions online. And one of these, so this panel is meant to be a science-based panel, not really a policy-based. But one of the next questions is around who should pay for CCUS projects. And that's really a policy question. And the question is, should it be the fossil fuel companies? So we won't really answer that here, but just to add that there is a concept, again from Miles Allen, Oxford University, carbon take-back obligation, about making an obligation on fossil fuel producers for every ton of CO2 they produce, and is emitted, that they should capture and inject beneath the ground. And this concept is evolved into the Net Zero Industry Act in the European Union now has a storage obligation on oil and gas producers in the EU. In proportion to their production in the EU, they are to make available storage capacity for industrial emitters to use for their CO2. I think from the memory, maybe 30 million tons a year capacity available by 2030. So that's in a way putting the obligation on the oil and gas companies themselves. And we have seen, obviously the incentives depend upon the country and the policies they have in place. But in Norway, with their offshore carbon tax, that was specifically a tax on CO2 emissions for the oil and gas industry on offshore emissions. That in itself was enough to incentivize the Sleipner project by Statoil, then now called Equinor, that started operating in 1996, and that was about a $40 a ton tax at that time. So there's different policies in place, and it's up to the countries to decide on how they incentivize CCS projects in their jurisdiction. We have another question online. What is carbon lock-in? And I think that refers to the concept of where you have large-scale investments in plant, be it power plant or industrial plant. And these power plants may run for 20, 30, 40 years by design. And so they're locked in, and that investment has got to pay back over that period of time. And one of the concerns is countries building carbon-intensive large-scale plant and committing themselves to those emissions. Well, the good thing about carbon capture and storage is it can be retrofitted to existing energy assets, large-scale capital assets. You bolt it onto the flue stack. So long as you've got physical space, you bolt it on. The Boundary Dam project in Canada is a retrofit. The Brevik capture on a cement plant in Norway is a retrofit. So I think that answers that question. I'll come back to the room. Are there any more questions in the room? Yes.
Thanks, Tim. Johan Eithling, Chief Executive Tree. We're a technology provider for CCS.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
I'll try and talk a bit louder. Thank you very much to the panel for this very informative conversation today. My question is, and I'm a huge optimist, 7.6 gigatons per year, how much space do we actually have in the ground? Like, how many years does that give us to sequester?
So the IPCC AR6 estimated there's about 1,000 gigatons of storage capacity on the planet. That's more than enough in the IPCC's view that is needed for CCS's role, along with all the other technologies, all the renewables and nuclear and energy efficiency, for its role in achieving limiting warming to 1.5. So we have enough storage capacity to do that. It's not evenly distributed. Not every country has geological storage. And that's one of the things that a country has to do, is understand whether they have the storage in their own jurisdiction. And that's why also the new projects coming along, like the Northern Lights project in Norway, whose business model is taking CO2 by ship from other countries and taking it to an onshore receiving facility and injecting it via pipeline 50 kilometers offshore deep in the geology beneath the North Sea. So they have now 4 contracts from 2 bioenergy plants in Denmark and Sweden, a cement plant in Norway, the Brevik plant, and also a fertilizer plant in Netherlands or Belgium. As well as those 4 contracts, there are 30 more expressions of interest. And we're seeing this business model of taking CO2 and disposing of it as a service get a lot of interest now. And that's really important for countries. They don't have to have their own geological storage. And for the projects, for the industries themselves, they don't have to develop the storage themselves. They can pay the Northern Lights project to take their CO2. So the same's happening in Japan. Japan does not consider that it has enough storage for all of its CO2 emissions. They're developing the feasibility of 9 large-scale projects. 5 of those, they're planning to export the CO2 to other countries. And 3 of those, in principle, are to Malaysia for offshore storage. And there's MOUs in place. And yes, Malaysia's introduced a regulation for offshore geological storage early this year. So the fact that the country might not have the geology now isn't so much of a barrier as it would have been considered a few years ago. So I think we're getting to the end of the session. I'm asked to point back to Slido, and there's a question on Slido about whether this session has improved your understanding of CCUS. And for us in the room to quickly get a response, can I ask you to put your hands up if you think you've learned something from this session? Okay, that's pretty comprehensive. So thank you for that. So I think any final questions from the room before we wrap up? I will recommend, because this was a science-based session, not really policy-based, there's lots of good examples of policy around the world, and the most developed and interesting really is the UK. And I'm saying that not just because we're in the UK Pavilion, and this event's been organised by the UK Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, but genuinely they've introduced a policy of not just stimulating a project of CCS, but an industry. So the two projects proceeding in the UK are cluster projects, each one with a large storage site with multiple CO2 sources feeding into those. So they're going from zero to full industry for two cluster projects with various incentives such as carbon contracts for difference, regulated asset base for the transport and storage infrastructure, and the UK Trade Association, the CCSA, has played a major role in that policy development, making it evidence-based, but also realising the complexities of putting together different players from different industry sectors. So the legal arrangements are interestingly complex, but workable, because they're going ahead. They've got final investment decisions on 5 parts of those 2 clusters now, and they're going ahead to construction. So with that UK plug, which they didn't ask me to do, but I'm saying it, out of a genuine reason, it's a good country to look at. I think we should thank now our panelists, Professor Catherine Romanak, Dr. Jen Roberts, Dr. Yasmin Mota, Dr. Ala Kordaji, Natalia Weber. Thank you very much for all your inputs over this session, and thank you everybody for coming and being interested in coming to learn more about CCS. And hopefully we've helped bust some of these CCUS myths. So thank you very much.